Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. Really glad you could join us today. So it is Thursday. It's August 22nd. It's 1 p.m. local time. And I hope everybody is strapped in and ready for our premier Freight Market Roundup show. No visuals. I try to make it as easy to digest some of these complicated topics as possible. Actually, today is pretty straightforward. So, besides the never ending acronyms that are in our realm, which I'll try to break down every time for you, it's going to be relatively straightforward. So if this is your first first ship show, welcome. My name is Jason Brand. I am the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. So if you haven't heard of SCS, as we call ourselves, just drop an acronym early. We are a full-service supply chain management organization. So we ship to and from more than 150 countries yearly, and we handle basically every link in the chain when it comes to moving and managing goods. And actually, quite frankly, we handle every link in the chain. If you have not worked with us in the past, it is a great time to start. We're doing a couple network redesigns right now. They've been very exciting, and honestly, it's a good year to kind of figure out how you want to plan for next year. We've talked about this in the show. We've got a couple other transportation companies that have been reworking themselves and trying to grab market share this year with the slightly lackluster year that it's been. Anyway, so before we begin on touching on our topics, I do like to do this. It's a little bit of housekeeping. I always like to run through our agenda. So if you get lost, you get an idea of where we are and where we're headed. So first things first, I'm going to talk about the ocean shipping market. I'm going to run through a few of our major shipping lanes. I like to discuss where the prices are at, what our customers are currently seeing on the lane, and a little bit of the trend that we're seeing as well. And also kind of some expectations of what we are thinking is going to happen going forward. We obviously don't have a crystal ball, but, Anthony and I, we've gone back in time and kind of looked at what our track record was, and we're pretty spot on. We could do like the on target kind of thing, but, no visuals, so too bad. Anyway, so beyond that, what do we like to do? After we talk about the ocean freight market, we like to continue into some of the major events that are happening in the marketplace that are affecting us, that are affecting our customers, things our customers have brought up like, hey, what are you doing about this? We like to bring those up right afterwards. And finally, I'm going to run through what's happening in the air freight market as it pertains to costs our customers are seeing. So thank you so much. Now, despite that agenda, I'm going to totally sidestep it because I got to talk about something going on. It's extremely pertinent, and that is what is happening in Canada because, unfortunately, it's official. The rail lines locked out their workers. And basically what was said is after some final negotiations last night, it did not go well, and the rail lines locked the doors, and no union workers were allowed in. So the disruption, I think the important factor here is this disruption did not start today. It was already starting. So over the course of this week and even last week, operations at Canada's West Coast ports, they'd already begun slowing down because of this. So looking at Vancouver's intermodal rail yard as of Monday had already reached capacity. Let that sink in for a second. So Port Authority data is showing that intermodal boxes are sitting longer than average. Dwell times are looking at up to 7 days at the start of this week. That's nearly double from what we were seeing last month, which was an average of 4 days. CN and CPKC, the two rail lines that did the lockout, they said that they sent final agreements over last night. They received no feedback as of this morning, so they locked out their union employees. In general, the big concern here is that any work stoppage is pretty much guaranteed to massively disrupt the movement of cargo, and that could last for literally weeks, but potentially even months going forward. And this becomes especially true when you look at some of the ports that heavily rely on rail. So I'm talking about Vancouver and Prince Rupert. Now, there has been a lot of effort to try to mitigate as much of this potential backlog as possible. And port authorities have been telling vessels that are currently kind of steaming towards them to, hey, slow down your speed, see if you can make it here by the time all this is kind of worked out. Which is unfortunately unlikely, but and really try to wait out the lockout. Now, also, there has been a massive push to reroute some of those vessels to U.S. port destinations. And then finally, of course, there has been a lot of communication with the trucking companies, simply trying to get equipment and people in place as fast as possible to handle the influx of all of this cargo. Now, all that's nice, but unfortunately, there's been a couple of these, I'm going to use a lot of quotes today, come back to reality kind of checks. in moments. So the British Columbia Trucking Association CEO, he actually responded to all these preparatory measures with a word of caution, essentially saying there is actually no possibility that trucking will be able to fill the gap of the Canadian rails, period. So a couple quick facts on this. Over 900,000 metric tons of goods move daily on Canada's railway. And despite what's been happening in the US with a relatively soft trucking market, on the flip side, it's been quoted that Canada's trucking market is already running near capacity. So it's not like there's all this excess supply available to soak up these rail cars or these rail shipments. Now, as a reminder, if you are shipping into Canada and you're potentially finding yourself heading into this disruption, we're doing a little thing right now. We're offering a short-term discounted rate for just storage at any one of our facilities. It has to have room. There's a few of our facilities that are completely full. But just reach out to us, see if we've got a facility near you or in the area. It's a discounted rate only for a short-term period. The idea is if you're affected by this rail situation happening, you can kind of try to wait it out at one of our facilities at a lower cost, but then we do have to figure a way to kind of get the product moving because it's not really designed to be in those facilities. We normally go person by person. So reach out to us if that is something you're interested in. You can reach out to me directly, or you can go to our website and go through the contact us page, or just talk to your account manager. Now, let's move on to the agenda that I proposed a little earlier. Let's get into the ocean shipping market, shall we? So first of all, obviously, we're going to come back to that Canada situation, but it is extremely severe. But let's talk about what's happening in the Trans-Pacific. So if you are shipping from Southeast Asia or China into the US West Coast, this is also known as our Trans-Pacific lane, you're likely noticing a nice trend of prices heading downward, at least for the most part. Because what we just went through was a little GRI. GRI stands for general rate increase. It happened last week. It temporarily slowed the downward trend that we were seeing and enjoying on this lane. But it is pretty clear that already so far this week that the GRI is not going to be sticking. So we're already seeing prices heading back down again. So our customers, they're seeing prices right now around $6,650 per FEU. FEU stands for 40-foot container unit. And what's pretty clear about this is until the disruption in Canada really starts forcing freight through the US ports, you should expect this lane to continue to creep downward. Now, big asterisks on that, because obviously this is on the very short term. Obviously, the rail lockout has occurred. Obviously, there was a slowdown already leading up to this lockout. And as a reminder, right on the horizon, pardon me, we've got the East Coast and Gulf Coast US disruption. So any downward creep is short-lived. Basically, what I'm saying is get your cargo in now if you can, because it could get pretty messy come September 30th for sure. Now, anyways, let's keep rocking and rolling. We're going to head over to the transatlantic lanes. Specifically, we're looking at shipments that are leaving European ports and headed into the US East Coast. So this lane is seeing a slight volume boost, and we're going to explain this a little bit more later in some more depth. But back in early August, our customers were paying right around $1,760 per 40-foot container, 40-foot equivalent unit, or FEU. And now we're seeing rates right around $1,800. Now, it's not that big of a jump, obviously. It's $40, but we were watching this lane creep downward for months and months and months and months on end. So any increase in price we have not seen in a very long time. And, we are likely for the next few weeks going to see this price edge higher as that ILA contract negotiation starts to heat up, starts to get to its expiration point, and that anticipation of a shutdown starts to become a reality, kind of trickling into shippers' planning. Now, before I talk about that some more, let's move on. Let's talk about the final ocean major shipping lane we're going to discuss today. And that is our China and Southeast Asia shipments that are headed into Europe. So generally speaking, these would go through the Suez Canal. We generally used to call this the Suez Canal lane, but obviously they're going around through the Cape of Good Hope. So very, very long tour to get to their final destination. Now, back in the beginning of July, the price was roughly around $8,520 when shipping on this lane. And as of now, our customers are paying $7,800. So both those are in 40-foot equivalent units, FEUs. And really over the course of roughly a month and a half, we watched this price drop about $700. Now, again, obviously it's more than $60, $40. But obviously this lane's substantially more expensive. Still, it's not much of a dent in this price. This price is highly overpriced. It has good reasons to be compared to other lanes, but still highly overpriced. But it really is a sign that this lane is headed in that direction relatively consistently. If we looked week over week what we were seeing for our customer shipping on that lane, you'd see that kind of slow and steady degradation. It's artificially high for the moment given what is going on, but it is heading in the right direction, which is a good thing. So let's kind of take a step back. I mentioned this earlier. We've got that little bit of growth we're seeing on the East Coast. And at the moment, that's happening. But the reasons behind this are extremely clear, right? So Hapag-Lloyd, their CEO, he said in a press briefing just recently that they're noticing their customers right now are starting to front load their inventory wherever they can. And they also are seeing a broader trend of an early restocking season on the lane. Now, this is pretty clear that it's a sign that shippers are bracing themselves for a potential disruption. One of those obviously being that Canadian rail lockout, which, as I mentioned, it already officially started this morning. But the other is the ILA negotiations that are happening on the U.S. East and Gulf Coast ports. So let's continue with that ILA topic, because as a reminder, just for a side note, ILA stands for the International Longshoremen's Association. Their negotiations are with the U.S. port employers that are on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast ports. And those negotiations have not improved since we last discussed about them. Actually, over the course of the year, it's been very, very incremental gains. There has been some major moments where they made some progress, and we can discuss that. We'll have to discuss that in September as we get very close, just run through the timeline. But there has been, not to say there hasn't been progress at all, but they are definitely far from where they need to be, especially given the September 30 deadline. So it has been made exceedingly clear since the beginning of this year, actually before the beginning of this year, that any strike action from the ILA would happen just following the contract's expiration, which, as a reminder, again, is September 30th. So the chance of getting a deal signed on this timeline right now, with how close we are to September 30th, is very, very, very unlikely. There's just too many hot topics still on the table. And if you compare this to the ILWU contract negotiation, or even, and that was the US, and then also there is the Canada ILWU negotiation, both of those had very, very heated ends, and they both went over their contract dates. So the chance of the ILA getting this contract signed by September 30th, very low. Also, they're asking for substantially more than these other negotiations we're asking for. It's just a lot of factors pretty much saying this will happen. There was a comment from Maersk's CEO that said the likelihood of a strike is lower than they're making it seem to be. He said he's expecting it to go into a contract extension. And that's directly against what the ILA president said there will be no contract extension. So we'll just have to see if this is a bunch of saber rattling, or we'll have to see if this is actually going to turn into a massive strike on September 30th. So we'll have to wait. Now, carriers are kind of waiting on this. They've responded to, well, obviously they've waited. Their CEOs have waited, but they've waited from a policy, from a fee standpoint is really the better way of putting it. And they kind of signaled their expectations that there's going to be a disruption by announcing peak season surcharges. The amounts, though, are literally all over the place. So MSC comes out with just a ridiculous number. They're like, peak season surcharge, $1,000 per FEU. That's pretty much doubling the current rate on the East Coast at the moment. So pretty laughable, quite frankly. But other carriers, they are being way more realistic. We're seeing prices between $300 and $600 for peak season surcharges. All of these pretty high. I guess $300 would be the only one I'd say is reasonable given the total price of the lane and the percentage that is. But just keep in mind, there's a lot of bets that things will go awry on the East Coast right now. So if you're still planning on shipping into the East Coast, particularly as we approach September 30th, and particularly now that we have this Canadian rail lockout happening, strongly consider your options. Really make sure you're building a contingency plan, because you are at a massive risk. And it's not like your container is just going to sit in the port for a few weeks and get picked up and moved, and you'll be a little bit behind schedule. These bubble up to some really terrible circumstances where you can be slapped with extreme amounts of fees, or beyond that, you may not ever get your container, which is just unbelievable. But anyways, Let's move forward. I want to talk about the air freight market a little bit before we talk about the air freight rates we're seeing. And really, this is because we've been seeing some trends that are totally redefining the basics of just volume shipping in general. I'm going to call this the Sheen effect. So, and I don't even think I coined that. I'm pretty sure I've read that and heard that. So we talked about how Sheen and Temu had been reshaping the air freight market. We talked about that actually months ago. But what's fascinating is that these platforms almost rely solely on air freight to deliver just massive quantities of packages. And they also ship to the major markets. They're shipping to the US and they're shipping to Europe. So what this has caused is this really strange constant peak season effect in the air market. Now, if you look at just the industry in general, they're suggesting that e-commerce accounts for around 20% of the global air freight volume. And the volume that's expected to be exported from China every single day on air freighters, primarily by these two companies, Sheen and Temu, fills 50 to 80 air freighters on a daily basis. It's just unbelievable. So a market update by an Australian-based company, they're a trade and transport group. They pretty much found that overall international air cargo tonnage handled on the Asian Pacific airports, it was up by almost 14% from January through July. Now, most of the growth of that volume was in China. That was up 32% year over year in the first 7 months of 2024. And then Hong Kong volume was up by 24% in the same period. Now, you could just say, oh, well, the market in general is just getting lifted. But if you look at other locations throughout, particularly Northeast Asia, you're not seeing anywhere near that same level of growth. And the crazy part of this switch in shipping style is it's kind of challenging the conventional shipping thought process, right? Versus what goods do you ship air? Why do you ship air versus what you ship in ocean? So for example, Apple, they made a huge announcement last year. They were like, you know what? We're changing how we do business essentially when it comes to logistics versus air freighting all of their products, which they generally do. And normally expensive electronic devices tend to be shipped air. They said, we're going to switch to ocean and we're going to do it for the environmental reasons. So they said they were switching to ocean. Total shift on how you do expensive electronic shipping. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but we're not going to go into it right now. Now, what you're seeing today is those same air freighters, instead of being filled with expensive electronics, are now filled with this ultra high volume, ultra low value garment products. It's just completely the opposite from what we normally experience. Now, it's fascinating, and there actually is this customs loophole that's called the de minimis value, and it's in many ways just being exploited and it kind of allows this to occur. So we're going to discuss this particularly next week. We're going to go into this in depth because there is a chance this legislation could be changing in 2025 or even before. There's actually already been some legislation this year chipping away at the de minimis value, but we will discuss that more in the future. Now, let's move on. Let's talk about the air freight market and the rates that we're currently seeing coming out of Southeast Asia and China. Now, actually, we're still kind of elevated, but actually at a decent price compared to what we've been seeing over the course of the year. Right now, customers on average are paying $6.04 a kilo, and that's shipping into the US from Southeast Asia and Chinese origins. But when we look across all of our origin destination pairs, you're seeing a low of around $5.45 a kilo and a high of around $6.50 a kilo. And it's not the lowest we've seen all year, but it's pretty low in comparison, which is shocking when you consider these numbers, especially when you compare it to what you see coming out of Europe into the US. But I really appreciate you guys all for joining. This is our freight market roundup. We try to keep it under 20 minutes. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, also YouTube, just to kind of fit into your life the best way possible. We appreciate you guys joining. Make it a great week, and join us next week because we're going to be talking about the de minimis value and how that could be changed and how it could affect you. Thanks. Bye.